Today's Old Testament lesson is Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on the throne, high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings, and 2 they covered with their faces, and 2 they covered with their feet, and 2 they flew. And one called to another, said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots on the threshold shook at the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed, your sin is blotted. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And I said, Here I am, send me. Our New Testament lesson is Luke chapter 5, 1 through 11. Once Jesus was standing beside the lake of Gennesaret, and the crowd was pressing him to hear the word of God. He saw 2 boats there at the shore of the lake. The fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little way from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch. Simon answered, Master, we've worked all night long and have caught nothing. Yet if I say so, I will let down the nets. When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help. And they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. For he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. Then Jesus said to Simon, Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people. And when they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and they followed him.
Well, for a number of weeks now, and for a few more to come, the lectionary provides readings from the two major prophets of the Bible, Isaiah and Jeremiah. After last week, in which the wonderful yes of God was explored, encouraging us to find our own calls, the lectionary challenges us again to decide what it is that God is inviting us to do, knowing that God is a God of grace. On the one hand, we are called to receive this grace in our own lives and enjoy the freedoms that it brings us. But on the other hand, we are also called to become participants in God's gracious work as God calls us to follow an alternative way of being and to share that way with those around us. And so last week we focused on the call of Jeremiah. And you might recall that Jeremiah was unsure that he would be able to provide the prophetic voice that God was asking for. Well, this week we focus on the call of Isaiah, who seems a little more willing. Call is a big deal in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, and in all of our lives in general. You already know that God calls each of us. We talked about that last week in one way or another. For me, it was a trip to Arizona that made me feel a real sense of call for the things that I witnessed there. Today, though, Isaiah receives a call from God, and Jesus, in the Luke reading, calls the Gospels to catch people now. So I ask you, can you name any professions or jobs that call people to them? Have any of you ever felt called to a specific position in your life? Come on, answers. Teaching, absolutely. Hospital work, absolutely. Any others? There are tons of them. People are in the military because they feel a strong call to protect our country. There are so many different examples. Well, here's another question, and you don't have to answer this one out loud. I want you just to think about it. Have you ever had something happen in your life that you just knew was a God moment? We might call it a God pause moment. Something happens to us where we suddenly feel that God has sent a message our way, a strong message. Or maybe God is just showing off at these times. If you've ever been to Niagara Falls, I bet you had a God moment there. Many people called into ordained ministry have such moments that they remember and can vividly describe. In fact, I would wager that most pastors can remember the very moment they were called into ministry. I have to tell you, I've told my call story so many times, and yet I never ever get tired of repeating it. It's even one of the very first blog posts on my blog. I have to confess I haven't kept up with my blog, but in case you're curious about the call story, it's a blog that's called The Accidental Minister. And so this morning I want to share with you part of that story. But I'm not going to read it from the blog. I'm going to tell you the story because it's one I know pretty well. My first day in seminary, we spent most of our classes sharing our call stories. There were probably 35 people in my class at Methodist Theological School. And on that first day, we were all nervous and excited. Some of us wondered what on earth we were doing there. How had we ended up there? And yet, when it came time for each of us to tell our stories, we did it. And I got to tell you, it took a while. Because pastors love telling their call stories. It seems that all of us know when God has given us that nudge, telling us that we've got bigger fish to fry, or maybe I should say, fish to catch. What is amazing about the call stories shared, though, that first day in seminary, was the differences between them all. We had all been called to ordained ministry, and yet none of our stories were the same. You know, you listen to God, and God encourages you to do something, and you ignore it, and you ignore it as long as you can, until finally you just say, "All right, God, I hear you. I'm going to do it." So here's a disclaimer. I might have told you this story before. I might have told you parts of it before. So I hope you don't mind hearing it again if you have heard some of it. I've always said that for me, it all started with a wedding cake. So here's the shortened version of my story for you this morning. Well, maybe it's not so short. My grandparents were born in Ukraine and arrived in the USA through Ellis Island in 1913. My mom was always very concerned that we know our Ukrainian traditions, that we know exactly what it meant to be Ukrainian. So maybe it really all started with my mom making sure that my 4 siblings and I got to the Ukrainian church on a regular basis. I got to tell you, my Uncle Steve was the best Ukrainian dancer. You know that dance where they get down like this and they kick out their feet? It's amazing. Well, he did that like a champ. We were all brought up in the church. We all had our first Holy Communions in the church, the Ukrainian Catholic Church at that time, later the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. My mom was Ukrainian Catholic, my dad was Ukrainian Orthodox. But I gotta say that by the time we got to be teenagers, my parents had become so busy running my grandparents' grocery store, now that my grandparents were older, that we just didn't get to church very much. But I have to say, even so, my mom had the biggest influence on us because she was very religious, even though she would never have claimed that to be the case. But she always went to those special worship services, like on Maundy Thursday or Good Friday or Holy Saturday. The irony is, if you asked her if she was religious, she would say, no, not at all. So she would give us a choice about going to church at those times. My choice usually was to go with her, but it had nothing to do with going to church. It had more to do with just being with my mom. And I didn't really realize the significance of those special services that we attended. I know now that many of them happened on Holy Week. We would get to church, the sanctuary would be darkened and mostly filled with short, stout babushkas wearing black dresses, looking sad and serious. They would actually lie prostrate on the ground during parts of the service. I remember that we stood in a long line of grandmas waiting for a chance to go by what was probably a papier-mâché cave, big one, and inside there was a painting of Jesus, and it was covered, laminated in plastic, but it was Jesus lying in the cave, and you could see his wounds. And these ladies would go up, crawl up to the cave, they would kiss his wounds. I didn't do that, but I did walk up, and I looked in, and I would touch him. Things like that really stick in your memory. By college, I was barely interested in church at all. And it wasn't until my first child, Matt, turned 5 that I began once again to think about going to church. And so, the first church in Oberlin was walking distance. Why not go there? But not only that, there was a church member there who kept reminding me that the church was there. And she would say, "You've got to come, Alana. You really will like this church. It's very welcoming." And so I actually attribute Carol to being one of the biggest reasons that I went to church. She invited me over and over. And so I attended church religiously, taking Matt so that he could go to Sunday school. I served on the Christian Ed committee, and I served on a search committee for an associate pastor. I'd often help with children's ministry, with the children's worship service. I even led the youth group there for a little while. And you know, it wasn't until an interim minister at that church, a woman who'd been there for about a year and a half or so, between our ministries, asked in worship one Sunday if any of us had ever been called to ministry or felt that we had been called to ministry. I was way in the back, and I sheepishly put my hand up. And I almost felt like I needed to make it go down again, because was I really feeling this way? There was one other person who did the same thing, although I gotta say he was a little bit more assertive about it. Sometime later, as a caterer and a restaurant owner by that time, I was delivering a wedding cake I had made to the very tiny Henrietta UCC church. Have any of you ever been there? It is a beautiful, small church. And so I walked into the church, I set the cake down on a table as I'd been directed to by the ladies in the kitchen. I carefully placed fresh flowers all around it and between the layers. I loved the way those cakes looked after they were finished and all ready for the wedding reception. I don't remember if I asked if I could see the sanctuary or if I just gravitated in that direction, but I'd gotten a glance at it as I walked in, and I really wanted to see it. I felt I had to go in. And when I stepped through the door into the worship space, I was awestruck. Tiny little church, so much smaller than the church I was going to in Oberlin. I'll bet you there was room for maybe 50 people who were sitting really close together. And I stood in that spot in complete silence, in the darkness, and watched as the sunlight began to create elongated, colorful shapes through the glass windows onto the floor. And the brightness of the light was kind of changing with the movement of the trees outside. Their polished wooden altar gleamed with modest carved details. And I stood in that spot feeling a sort of warmth. It just came over me. A sort of knowing washed over me. Time actually slowed down. And I remained in that moment for what was probably too long for the church ladies who wanted me to get out of the church so they could get back to work. As I prepared to leave, as I turned back to the door, I said to myself, this is exactly the kind of church I would want to pastor. And at that very moment, I knew what I needed to do. And I started looking online for seminaries, for Bible schools that I could go to. The Hallmark movie channel would call this a God wink. Anybody ever had a God wink? Yeah, probably we all have. There is a Luther seminary daily devotional that's called God Pause, and it explains Isaiah's experience this way. Although likely infrequent, what happened to Isaiah shaped and transformed his life and revealed his true calling. Recognizing his own failings, Isaiah marveled at being blessed to see the God of hosts. Forgiven and freed from sin, he had newfound courage to boldly answer God's call. As we pause to allow the living word to speak to our hearts, we hear the Lord saying to us, "Whom shall I send?" Pausing to marvel at awe and in wonder of God's presence in our lives, it evokes a kind of humility and obedience. Faith and trust embolden us to overcome our imperfections and our limitations so we can embrace that call and say to God, "Here I am, send me." This Isaiah passage happens to be the one I chose for my ordination sermon, preached by my mentor at the time, Reverend Kelly Brill, who was the pastor for 35 years at Avon Lake United Church of Christ. Of course, in the gospel, the Luke reading for this morning, The disciples are called now to catch people and to teach them about the way of Jesus and to teach them to love and accept and to heal. This is what it means to be called to this church. Being called is such a beautiful and sacred event in anyone's life, and many of you have been called. We talked about this last week, to direct the worship service in the absence of a pastor. You've been searching for a pastor. You've had meetings about who will come. You have felt called to find the pastor who is called to be here. So get ready, because of course your new pastor will come here after responding to a call from God to this church specifically. And God will be guiding that pastor to do what is best for this church and for all of you. And sometimes God's wishes don't quite align with our own. So do keep an open mind and let God direct the work that needs to be done here. God will be with your pastor, and God will be with all of you, just as God has been with each of you. So keep awake for the God winks that are sure to come over the next few months and years. Trusting in God's call is so vitally important to the ministries for which God calls each and every one of God's churches.